Fort Jefferson is the third largest coastal fort ever constructed by the United States, and it was built here at the Dry Tortugas because of the strategic nature of the harbor here within these islands.
There's a massive fortress sitting on a deserted Florida island, and what happened inside those walls wasn't supposed to be possible. From the outside, it looked like power. 16 million bricks rising from the Gulf of Mexico. So remote, it barely felt like part of America. Florida Keys, an island chain just south of Miami and the Everglades, is a forgotten military fort. That's right. Even Juan Ponce de Leon claimed in 1513 that the area was the oldest territory in the United States to be inhabited by Europeans. But isolation created problems nobody planned for. Strange occurrences, chilling events, and one outbreak that turned this military stronghold into something far more dangerous. This is the story of Fort Jefferson, where survival wasn't guaranteed, and the truth took over a century to fully understand. What you're about to discover involves hidden secrets, unexpected discoveries, and one prisoner whose shocking outcome changed everything. Let's start with the part that still doesn't make sense. The fortress that defies logic. Picture this: 70 miles of open water, no roads, no towns, no natural fresh water, and rising straight out of the Gulf of Mexico. A fortress so massive, it became the largest brick structure in the entire Western Hemisphere. Fort Jefferson sits on Garden Key in the Dry Tortugas, and the first time you see it, the reaction is universal. How does something this big even function out here? The scale alone is staggering. 6 massive sides, 3 tiers of gun placements, space for 450 heavy cannons, walls 50 feet high and 8 feet thick in some places. All of it built from 16 million bricks stacked on an island that's barely above sea level. This wasn't a small outpost. This was engineered to dominate one of the most strategic maritime choke points in North America. Visitors who know the site describe the same feeling. Longtime guide Adam Hollywood put it bluntly: you feel like you've dropped off the map. If you were stationed here, you understood immediately. If something went wrong, help wasn't coming fast. Walk through the inner corridors today and you'll spot the irregularities. Light-colored bricks from Florida suddenly give way to darker ones from Maine. That wasn't an aesthetic choice. The Civil War cut supply lines mid-construction, forcing workers to adapt. Even the walls themselves hide compromises that reveal how desperate things became. Fresh water was so scarce that construction crews eventually carved trenches into the floors of cell blocks just to catch rainwater. That's not supposed to happen in a fortress designed to project strength. But here's what makes this location truly strange. Despite all these obstacles, the U.S. government kept building for nearly 3 decades through wars, hurricanes, and logistical nightmares that would have shut down any normal project. Which raises an obvious question. What made this remote location worth that level of human effort? The answer comes down to fear, and what the United States feared most in the early 1800s reveals exactly why they built a massive fortress on a deserted Florida island that looked completely unusable. Why America built an impossible fortress? The Gulf of Mexico was a choke point that could determine whether American trade stayed secure or collapsed overnight. And the Dry Tortugas, despite looking like a collection of sandbars barely above water, controlled that gateway better than any other spot on the map. Ships entering the Gulf had to pass south of these islands, making the location a natural surveillance point for any military power that wanted to monitor or block maritime traffic. This wasn't speculation. As Adam Hollywood explained, any large ships would have to sail to the south of us and then up into the Gulf of Mexico. In other words, whoever controlled this remote location controlled movement into one of America's most important commercial regions. That alone justified extreme construction in a place with no resources and no real land to speak of. But here's where it gets interesting. The first major official to inspect the dry tortugas thought they were completely worthless. Commodore David Porter visited the islands and saw nothing but sand and coral a few inches above sea level. No natural harbor, no defensive advantages. He dismissed the idea outright and recommended the government forget about it entirely. If an experienced naval officer said the islands were useless, why did construction begin anyway? Because the next survey changed everything. When Commander Josiah Tatnall III arrived in 1829, he saw what Porter missed: a natural harbor deep enough for warships, narrow entrances that would be easy to defend, and most importantly, a position that made enemy occupation a direct threat to every American port from Florida to Texas. His report flipped the entire narrative. Suddenly, this deserted Florida island wasn't a liability, it was essential. Once that logic took hold, there was no turning back. Officials like Captain John G. Berard and even a young Robert E. Lee pushed for military reservation status. By 1846, construction officially began on what would become Fort Jefferson. Workers, many of them enslaved, labored in brutal heat, hauling materials across open water, while hurricanes periodically wiped out months of progress. The isolation that made the location militarily valuable became a daily obstacle for everyone building it. Every storm, every supply delay, every broken tool, all of it magnified by the fact that this construction site sat 70 miles from the nearest support. And then the Civil War erupted. Florida seceded. Supply lines fractured. The entire workforce model changed almost overnight. The Union suddenly had an isolated, half-built fortress in enemy territory, but it remained in Union hands, making its strategic importance even greater, which is when military officials realized something. If this place was already difficult to escape from during construction, it could serve another purpose entirely. The shift happened fast, and what came next turned this massive fortress into one of the most notorious prisons in American history, where survival became the primary concern and mysterious activities began almost immediately, when isolation became a weapon. By September 1861, Fort Jefferson stopped being just a construction site and became something far harsher. A military prison built on pure isolation. The first prisoners arrived that month, Union soldiers convicted of desertion. One prisoner later called it a government bastille, where shut out from the world we would dwell. It was accurate. Water on every side, sharks in the surrounding channels, a fortress interior designed to control movement, not provide comfort. You didn't need barbed wire here. The environment did the work. The numbers escalated quickly. By 1864, nearly 900 prisoners were packed into the casemates and unfinished chambers, guarded by just over 600 soldiers. Think about that ratio. Too many desperate men in a space that wasn't designed to accommodate them, with guards who were just as isolated and just as trapped. Conditions were brutal. Heat built up inside the brick walls with no way to escape it. Without a natural freshwater source, prisoners relied on cisterns and a desalination system that didn't always function. And remember, this wasn't a civilian prison with predictable routines. This was forced labor on an unfinished fortress in tropical heat, often described as a one-way ticket to death. Every day involved hauling materials, building fortifications, repairing structures, or working under direct military supervision. And because the fort was still evolving, prisoners constantly adjusted to new demands. They weren't just doing time. They were trying to stay alive in a place designed with zero margin for error. The strange occurrences inside the walls added pressure. Supplies didn't always arrive on schedule. Disease spread easily in the cramped quarters. The isolation magnified every problem. Something as simple as spoiled meat or a broken water barrel could create weeks of panic. If you were stationed here, guard or prisoner, You felt that tension building. But in July 1865, 4 men arrived who changed everything about Fort Jefferson. They'd been convicted in connection with Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and their presence turned this remote prison into the most scrutinized facility in the country. Among them was Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Maryland physician condemned for aiding John Wilkes Booth. And what happened to Mudd inside those walls set up a chain of events that nobody saw coming, because within 2 years, this man, punished, isolated, and thrown into the darkest corner of the fortress, would face a decision that would rewrite his entire legacy and expose just how fragile this abandoned site really was. The prisoner nobody expected. When Dr. Samuel Mudd arrived at Fort Jefferson in July 1865, he wasn't just another inmate. He was one of the most controversial men in America, convicted of conspiracy for setting John Wilkes Booth's broken leg after Lincoln's assassination. Prisoners knew who he was. Guards knew who he was. Washington knew exactly where they'd sent him. Mudd's first months followed the standard routine: labor, confinement, and the same brutal conditions every other prisoner endured. But in September 1865, just 2 months after arriving, Mudd attempted to escape by hiding aboard a supply transport. The attempt failed, and the consequences were immediate. He was dragged out, placed in heavy leg irons, and thrown into what prisoners called the dungeon, a ground-level gun room beneath the fort. That space wasn't metaphorical. It was a literal dark, low-ventilated chamber with one small window overlooking the moat where the toilets emptied. Another prisoner, Samuel Arnold, later described their confinement bluntly: shut out from the world, forced to endure 12-hour workdays in irons. Mudd's wife wrote directly to President Andrew Johnson after reading his descriptions of the conditions. The War Department eventually ordered the shackles removed and conditions improved, but the damage was done. By the time Mudd returned to the general prison population, he'd lost his position assisting in the fort's hospital. Instead, he was assigned to the carpentry shop. Hardly appropriate for a trained physician, but punishment wasn't meant to be logical. Despite everything, Mudd noticed the same problem everyone else did. This remote location made any crisis exponentially worse. A broken supply chain, a failed shipment, a bad storm. Everything had cascading consequences. The isolation that made the fortress strategically valuable also meant there was no safety net. That pressure was building day by day. And in August 1867, it finally broke. And when it broke, it didn't just threaten the prisoners or the guards. It threatened every single person trapped on that deserted Florida island, exposing the fort's most dangerous hidden secret, one that had been breeding inside the walls the entire time. When the fortress turned deadly, the breaking point hit on August 18, 1867. One prisoner fell ill. Fever, fatigue, nothing unusual at first, but within hours, more men collapsed. By nightfall, more than 30 people were sick simultaneously. That acceleration didn't make sense unless something far bigger was happening. And by morning, everyone inside Fort Jefferson understood they were dealing with exhaustion or bad food. They were facing a full-scale outbreak of yellow fever, one of the most feared diseases of the 19th century. If you were inside the fort that night, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Men who were already living on the edge now had a new threat. One they couldn't fight with labor, routine, or discipline. Symptoms escalated fast: high fever, delirium, jaundice, and internal bleeding. For a remote location with limited medical resources and no possibility of quick evacuation, this was a worst-case scenario. Here's the eerie part. Fort Jefferson had unknowingly created the perfect breeding ground. The same open barrels used to store desalinated water, the solution to the freshwater problem, had become nurseries for mosquitoes. The fort's attempt to solve one survival issue had directly enabled another deadlier one. The fort's physician, Dr. Joseph Sims Smith, worked until he couldn't. He treated patient after patient, moving through infected casemates while the disease spread. On September 5th, he collapsed from fever. 3 days later, he died. His death sent a wave of dread through the entire garrison that's difficult to overstate. Without a doctor, without understanding the disease, and without any realistic chance of evacuation, Fort Jefferson was suddenly an uncontrolled hotspot with no medical leadership. Commanding Officer Major Val Stone tried to contain the disaster. He created a quarantine hospital on Sand Key, a separate island 2.5 miles away. It didn't work. Patients isolated there received no meaningful care, and moving troops off Garden Key did nothing to stop transmission among those who remained. The disease was already inside the fortress itself, spreading through the barracks, the casemates, and the work crews. Samuel Arnold later wrote that prisoners had to stand the brunt of the fever, their only safety being an overruling providence. Translation: you were on your own. By October 1st, almost every inhabitant had fallen ill. The fort wasn't functioning as a prison anymore. It wasn't functioning as a military post. It was barely functioning at all. Guards couldn't guard. Workers couldn't work. Officers couldn't command. The entire operation was collapsing under a threat nobody could see or control. And with Dr. Smith dead, only one person on the island had the medical training to take control of the crisis. The same man that the government had condemned. The same man they'd chained in the dungeon for trying to escape. The same man who had every reason to let them all suffer. What Samuel Mudd did next didn't just save lives. It completely reversed his fate and revealed something about human effort that nobody expected from a prisoner labeled a conspirator in Lincoln's assassination. The shocking outcome nobody saw coming. When Dr. Smith died, Fort Jefferson lost more than its physician. It lost its last line of defense against total catastrophe. Hundreds of people were sick, supplies were stretched, fear was spiraling, and the only person on the island with real medical training was the man the government had publicly condemned, shackled, and thrown into the darkest corner of the fortress, Dr. Samuel Mudd. This was the moment everything changed. Mudd didn't hesitate, despite his resentment, despite the chains he'd worn, despite the escape attempt that nearly destroyed him. He stepped into the role no one else could fill. He walked straight into infected casemates, treated men collapsing from fever, and worked through nights where sleep wasn't an option. Even Arnold, who had every reason to stay guarded, admitted Mudd was never idle, always at post, faithful to his calling. But treating patients wasn't enough. The fort's design was working against survival. Mosquitoes swarmed the lower areas. Sick men were packed together in the worst possible locations. The bedding was filthy. Clothes weren't being changed between patients. And with no understanding of virology, every mistake added to the death count. Mudd changed the system fast. He moved patients to the second level of the fort, where stronger breezes flowed through the cannon hallways and mosquitoes struggled to reach. The results were immediate. Fewer bites, fewer new infections. He demanded clean bedding and fresh clothes for the sick, something the fort had failed to enforce before his involvement. He ended the failed quarantine on Sand Key, recognizing that isolating patients without proper care was condemning them. Instead, he centralized treatment inside the main fort where he could supervise every case. Look at the numbers. 270 total cases, only 38 deaths. That's a mortality rate of roughly 14%, dramatically low for 19th century yellow fever. Compare that to another outbreak at Fort Jefferson in 1873, which killed nearly 37% of those infected. Cities like New Orleans and Portsmouth suffered mortality rates between 28 and 43% during major outbreaks. Somehow, on this remote prison island, with minimal support and no understanding of mosquito transmission, Mud kept the death toll drastically lower than outbreaks in major cities with far more resources. Lieutenant Edin Zielinski, who survived the epidemic, wrote that Mud inspired the hopeless with courage, regardless of his own life, and that many owed their recovery directly to his care. Then, Zielinski did something unprecedented. He petitioned President Andrew Johnson to grant Mud clemency. Nearly 300 officers and soldiers added their signatures. Think about what that means. A man condemned for involvement in Lincoln's assassination had just become the hero of the most isolated fortress in America. Military personnel who'd witnessed his work firsthand were now advocating for his freedom, and Washington couldn't ignore it. In February 1869, President Johnson pardoned Mud, along with the other surviving Lincoln conspirators, imprisoned at Fort Jefferson. The man who'd entered as a villain left as a survivor, who'd proven his value under the worst possible circumstances. But Mud's unexpected discovery of redemption wasn't the only thing that changed. The outbreak exposed something fundamental about Fort Jefferson itself. This massive fortress, despite all its construction and human effort, was too fragile to sustain long-term operations. The isolation that made it valuable also made it vulnerable. And after 1867, the military began questioning whether this abandoned site was worth maintaining at all. The decline nobody could stop. When the yellow fever outbreak finally subsided, Fort Jefferson wasn't the same place it had been before. The people who lived through 1867 saw the fortress differently. A structure designed to project power had been exposed as fragile, overstretched, and nearly impossible to sustain. And for the first time, the army had to confront a reality that had always been there. A massive fortress on a deserted Florida island came with built-in weaknesses that no amount of engineering could completely fix. Construction had already slowed before the epidemic, but afterward, the momentum never returned. The fort had been under development for nearly 3 decades, yet it remained technically incomplete. Workers continued adding pieces, trying to finish a design that kept shifting with military needs. But by the early 1870s, it became clear Fort Jefferson was losing the race against time. Technology was evolving faster than brick walls could be built. Heavy masonry coastal forts were becoming outdated. The U.S. government was questioning the value of maintaining an installation that required constant supply runs and endless repairs just to stay functional. By 1874, the Army finally pulled most of the garrison out. The yellow fever outbreaks, the constant storms, and the logistical strain had taken their toll. Only a small caretaker force remained. The once busy prison population dropped to a handful. Construction crews disappeared, and without consistent maintenance, the structure began to crack, sink, and weather under the island's relentless humidity and erosion. Hurricanes hammered the fort repeatedly over the following decades. Some storms crushed brick arches, twisted metal supports, and flooded sections of the parade ground. Others wiped out supply structures and damaged what remained of the hospital spaces. Every storm reinforced the same point. The environment ruled this island, not the military. By the 1890s, Fort Jefferson was mostly abandoned. The Marine Hospital Service briefly used it as a quarantine station, another sign of how isolated and expendable the location had become. But even that didn't last long. Without full staffing or consistent investment, the fort slid deeper into neglect. For an installation once meant to control an entire region, the fall was rapid and strangely appropriate. The isolation that made the fort strategically powerful was the same force that ultimately broke it down. Remote locations demand constant attention. Fort Jefferson stopped receiving it, and nature took over. But the story doesn't end with abandonment, because this eerie, slowly collapsing structure eventually found a new purpose, one no architect or military officer could have predicted. And what remains today raises questions about how we remember places where survival once hung in the balance. What's left behind? If you visit Fort Jefferson today, the massive fortress is still standing, still dominating the waterline, 70 miles from mainland Florida. But now the guns are silent. The casemates are open to the wind, and the only permanent residents are frigate birds circling the ramparts. In 1992, the entire island chain became Dry Tortugas National Park. Visitors arrived by ferry, seaplane, or private boat. The same isolation that defined the fort in the 1860s remains exactly as it was, and that's what makes this place so striking. You can walk through the sally port, climb the spiral staircases, and stand in the actual dungeon where Samuel Mudd was held. The mismatched brick colors still show where Civil War supply lines collapsed. The cisterns built into the walls that helped create the yellow fever crisis are still there. The remains of the hospital where Mudd saved hundreds of lives. Every corner reveals the unexpected discoveries that come from a site where human effort collided with total isolation. Fort Jefferson never became what it was designed to be. It never fired a shot in combat. It never projected the military power its builders intended. Instead, it became the site of something far more compelling. A place where a man condemned for one of America's most notorious crimes became a hero by saving the people who punished him. That transformation didn't happen because of careful planning or military strategy. It happened because isolation created a crisis that demanded everything from the one person nobody expected to step forward. And that's the story Fort Jefferson really tells. Not about bricks and cannons, but about what happens when survival becomes the only thing that matters. So, here's the question worth considering as you look at those 16 million bricks still rising from the Gulf. What other moments in history were shaped by people trapped in places no one was watching?